Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
How in the world would a preacher ever find something good to say about people who publicly desecrated a Bible and did it in a really shameful manner?
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
The other day I was perusing a Twitter timeline, which isn't exactly known as a forum for intellectual pursuit, but I did come across a video of protesters on the West Coast snatching a Bible away from somebody and then playing soccer with it on the sidewalk. By the end of the video, the mangled Bible was tossed into an outhouse, much to the delight of the people who seemed to hate the book so much. But as primitive and ignorant as their behavior was, it was the thread of responses that actually got my attention. People were posting that the Bible is a document that causes oppression and denies people personal freedom. And it was time, these people said, to just get rid of the Bible. And I guess what I found ironic about that was the fact that the freedoms Americans enjoy, the ones you find in the amendments to the American Constitution, well, they were largely inspired by the Bible in the first place. I mean, there were other influences that contributed to the building of the American Republic, from the philosophy of the ancient Greeks to the works of agnostics and atheists during the Enlightenment. But the connection to the Judeo-Christian scriptures is undeniable. America really is a Christian nation. Now, that doesn't mean that the founders were trying to build a theocracy, a marriage of church and state, because, well, they absolutely weren't. In fact, they were doing precisely the opposite. Which is why I get so concerned when I see revisionist history being presented as actual fact. Because it seems to me that we're losing sight of just how valuable the American experiment really is. Now, don't get me wrong, it's also obvious to me that we sometimes clean up the story of this republic as if it's utopia. But anybody in possession of sensory organs can tell you it's not utopia. We have problems, and there's a lot to apologize for, and we do ourselves harm if we fail to do that. But at the same time, I think it's really important to recognize just how unique this experiment is. I mean, in the years since 1788, when the Constitution was finally ratified, and the years since 1791, when we added the Bill of Rights, a lot of other countries have imitated what the founders of this nation created, so that now it appears as if the liberties established here in the New World have always been a reality for most people. But they haven't. And it's easy to forget how unparalleled the birth of this nation really was. In fact, personally, I believe it was prophetic. And before you change the channel because you think I'm about to push for a marriage of church and state, don't touch the dial, because I'm not going to do that. By no means am I going to give you some kind of hagiography and pretend that this nation is heaven on earth. And under no circumstances do I believe that the Christian faith should ever be legally coerced on anybody, because among other things, that would be very un-American. But I do think it might be important to remember how the Bible played a formative role in making this place a reality. And I guess I want to underline the irony of people who have the freedom to desecrate a major religious document while insisting at the very same moment that they're being oppressed by it. Trust me, if this was a theocracy like the ones you find elsewhere on this planet, you wouldn't survive publicly desecrating a religious document. And I get it. There are people who claim to be Christians who seem to want to force their ideas on everybody else by law. I don't deny these people exist and that some of them are actually powerful people. But what I want to talk about is original intent. And I know I'm not going to do this justice in 28 minutes, so let me just put in a shameless plug for a little book I wrote a few years ago and released about the time when the 2020 presidential election was warming up. Because back then I strongly suspected that the political wheels were going to come off the American bus. And I wanted people to at least understand just a little bit why the American Republic exists and why it's structured the way that it is. The book is called Final Empire, and it's a really short, easy read. Trust me, I don't write complicated books. And I think that most people will find a few surprises when they read this thing, because a lot of us have long forgotten some key historical realities that everybody used to know. And this little book, it's not expensive. In fact, if I could, I'd give it to you for free, because I'm saddened by the collective amnesia we appear to be experiencing here in the Western world. I can't give it to you for free, but I think that most of you would find this book different from some of the others you've read, because it explains how the United States of America really is a Christian nation. But maybe not like you think. It's a Christian nation without an official state religion. And the Constitution was designed to make sure it stayed that way. Now, this book isn't exactly going to win a Pulitzer Prize because I wrote it, and I'm not exactly Dillard or Steinbeck, but I will say this. I spent years reading primary sources to collect the information you'll find in the book. So if you're interested, just go on over to my website, vop.com. Click on the Store tab to find your copy of Final Empire. Right now, I think I still have some of these in the warehouse, so you can get this book as long as supplies last. All right, I'm done with the infomercial, so let me try to describe why the rising ignorance about the biblical branch of the American family tree worries me. And again, just to be perfectly clear, I don't think I would ever insist that we should make desecrating a Bible or anybody else's religious text a crime. I mean, yes, if you're destroying somebody else's property, that is a crime. But if it's your own personal copy, I guess you can have at it. You're free to do that here. I believe that the founders of this republic were absolutely correct when they insisted that the church should keep its hands off the state and the state should keep its hands off the church. As most of you know, Thomas Jefferson described this as a wall of separation, and it might just be one of the greatest innovations since the dawn of Western civilization. I mean, let's just back up and talk about the religious atmosphere that existed in the Old World and think about why the Pilgrims chose to leave Leiden in the Netherlands to come here in 1620. Or maybe we should look at why they were living in the Netherlands in the first place, because, well, they were actually British. Historians refer to these people as dissenters because they were refugees from an oppressive church-state alliance that had been created in England. And all hopes for freedom of conscience had been scuttled by a number of legal developments that meant you had to be a member of the Church of England. Or actually, to be more accurate, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you had to worship as if you were, in their style. The government was prescribing forms of worship. I mean, technically on paper, back then you could believe whatever you wanted. And lots of people living in England at that time had widely divergent views about what it meant to be a faithful biblical Christian. All across Europe, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, there were hundreds of brand new variations on the Christian theme. And as you know, it created all kinds of political tension in a world where the church essentially governed the state. And in England, there was a great deal of insistence that everybody had to toe the official line, practice their faith in harmony with the Church of England. Now, you'd think that Protestants would be more tolerant of diversity after shaking off the intellectual shackles placed on them by the established church in previous centuries. But sadly, we've got lots of stories that prove otherwise, from John Calvin burning Michael Servetus at the stake because he was an anti-Trinitarian heretic, to the imprisonment of John Bunyan, who wrote his Pilgrim's Progress while sitting in prison for his religious crimes. So, what happened is that some of the people who longed for religious liberty closed shop and moved to the Dutch Republic, which I'm proud to say as a Dutch kid was the freest nation at that time in Western Europe. Somehow, in the Netherlands, broadly divergent religious groups were living in relative peace and harmony. And so the people who would become the Pilgrims found themselves living in the Dutch city of Leiden. To this day, you can still see their fingerprints all over that city. Now, in the Netherlands, some of these religious dissidents discovered another group that was fleeing from persecution. And that was the Jews who were running away from the Inquisition down south. When these two groups got together, they discovered something that set the table for the birth of America. And I'll be right back after this to tell you what that was.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. Sign up at BibleStudies.com today and start your journey of discovery.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
Most of the educated dissenters could actually read Latin, the language of learning back in that day. But very few of them could read the Bible in the original languages, which are Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew. In the Netherlands, when these people came in contact with the Jewish community, they began to rediscover the Hebrew Scriptures and had a chance to read some ancient Hebrew commentaries. These were documents they hadn't seen before. And that's when the Old Testament story of Israel's request for a king suddenly came to light. And the dissenters began to consider the possibility that human monarchy was not God's plan. Was it possible, they asked, that a lot of their problems were happening because monarchy was a departure from the system of government originally prescribed in the pages of the Bible? And if it was, would it be helpful to just get rid of the monarchy altogether? Of course, back then, that was a dangerous idea. It was considered sedition. But it was an idea that led to a lot of heated debate, and it became one of the biggest intellectual discussions of the 17th century. Was it possible, permissible even, to have a nation without a king? I mean, it was clear to them that God was angry with Israel's request for a king, and even a cursory reading of the Old Testament underlines how problematic those monarchies for Israel became. They proved to be a really bad idea. So, what if the dissenters could return to a social structure where individuals answered directly to God, instead of going through a king or even a state church? Back in the 16 and 1700s, the idea of birthing a republic was somewhat revolutionary. And I mean that literally revolutionary. But it was also irresistible. The ancient Israelites, before the anointing of their first king Saul, had lived in what was essentially a republic, a government founded on the rule of law, with the Torah as the supreme written constitution, the first 5 books of the Bible. In fact, if you go back to that time and read what the dissenters were writing, you'll find a number of them describing Old Testament Israel as, quote, the Hebrew Republic. So, as these English Protestants began to explore the intriguing idea of a world without kings, they also began to study passages like Deuteronomy chapter 17, where God predicted that Israel would one day ask for a king, so he gave them careful guidelines to mitigate the damage that a human monarch was going to cause. These political guardrails mandated in Deuteronomy chapter 17 became really big ideas that found their way into the thinking of the founders of this country. I mean, just listen to this. Here's what it says. When you come to the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests and the Levites. It shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children, in the midst of Israel. The safeguards laid out in this passage seem obvious to us living in the 21st century. But in the 17th century, these were revolutionary concepts. If there was going to be a king, God said, he had to be chosen according to heaven's guidelines. The top executive of the nation was not supposed to become an autocrat, but he had to answer to God just like everybody else. On top of that, he couldn't be a foreigner. He had to be somebody whose identity was so completely wrapped up in the nation that he wouldn't compromise the nation's integrity by importing bad ideas. The top executive, in other words, had to be one of the people. God also prohibited any kind of a return to the culture of Egypt, even if building ties to Egypt might promise greater prosperity. Because in Egypt, God's people had been slaves, and in this new republic, they were supposed to be free. Now, obviously, the American founders kind of got that one wrong because they only gave freedom to certain individuals. Slavery continues to be a massive black eye on the birth of this republic, and the horrible consequences for what we did are still with us to this day. And it's not as if these people didn't know they were doing the wrong thing, because there were Quakers from Pennsylvania who showed up at the constitutional hearings, and they made a very compelling case that if everybody was going to be consistent, slavery had to go. But the principle, still, even though they didn't practice it, was there. They didn't take it to heart for an embarrassingly long period of time, but it was there in seed form. Well, let me continue with the basic principles these English dissenters discovered in this passage in Deuteronomy 17. That passage underlined the idea that a king should not grow wealthy off the proceeds of office, or, if you will, there were some checks and balances on the king's power. And of course, we're still getting that one wrong too, because somehow a lot of people seem to get very wealthy as a result of holding public office here, but that's probably a topic for another day. Most importantly, Deuteronomy said that the king had to be subject to the rule of law like any other citizen. In reality, a monarch was said to be more responsible to the law, and he was required to make a personal copy and live by that for the rest of his life. So, the king or queen, it turns out, was just a human being like the rest of us, with no intrinsic privilege before God. While the monarch may have been vested with a degree of power and privilege, he or she was not above the people they governed. And of course, this is not the way that European monarchies functioned because of this misguided notion that emerged of the divine right of kings, where theologians said the person on the throne was God's special son or daughter and they were untouchable. The idea of the divine right of the monarch was actually a throwback to the pagan deification of emperors, and it was not an idea that came out of the scriptures. Now, to be sure, there were people who argued for the divine right of kings by misapplying the scriptures, just like there were people in the 19th century who tried to make a case for slavery by appealing to the Bible. But in light of Deuteronomy 17, the dissenters discovered these people were wrong. The Bible, from their perspective, was a very egalitarian document. So, to cut things short, because we got to take a break, a number of dissenters came to the conclusion that very early on, God had not intended to have a monarchy for his people. Israel was really designed as a republic under the supreme rule of law. Now, this was not an entirely new idea, because the English had already been flirting with that for centuries, ever since the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. Writing in the year 1260, Henry de Bracton, who is often called the father of English law, said, "The king himself ought not to be under man, but under God, and under the law, because the law makes the king. Therefore, let the king render back to the law what the law gives him, namely dominion and power. For there is no king where will and not law wields dominion." So, none of these ideas were brand new, but as is often the case, it took centuries of debate, centuries of trial and error, centuries of political struggle to make them a day-to-day reality. Human beings as a whole are really slow learners. And finally, with the birth of the American Republic, these ideas were codified as the supreme law of a brand new country. Now again, that doesn't make America utopia, because anybody who lives here knows firsthand that's just not true. We're still a nation of flawed human beings, and our application of these rather lofty principles has been plagued with all kinds of problems. So when people take to the streets to say there's injustice, they often have a point. But when people begin to suggest that maybe the founding principles are the problem and we should throw them in the wastebasket, well, that's when I start to get worried. Because what we have here is exceedingly rare, historically speaking. And while it's imperfect, it still represents the greatest advancement in personal liberty ever achieved up to this point. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages. Your whole family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon. Check it out today at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
John Locke is often considered to be one of the greatest minds in the history of political philosophy. And almost any course dealing with Western political thought will include a reference to his works. Like the dissenters, John Locke was forced to hide in the Netherlands because he was accused of hatching a plot to kill the king. And while he was in exile, he wrote this, a letter concerning toleration, which made really powerful arguments that the proper sphere of government should be restricted to civil matters, and that spiritual considerations were the proper sphere of the church. Here's what he said. The only business of the church is the salvation of souls, and it no way concerns the commonwealth or any member of it that this or the other ceremony be there made use of. Neither the use nor the omission of any ceremonies in those religious assemblies does either advantage or prejudice the life, liberty, or estate of any man. John Milton, the famous poet who gave us Paradise Lost, wrote these words about the way the Bible describes the proper realm of human governments. He said, "It follows, lastly, that since the king or magistrate holds his authority of the people, both originally and naturally for their good in the first place and not his own, then may the people, as often as they judge it for the best, either choose him or reject him, retain him or depose him, though no tyrant, merely by the liberty and right of freeborn men to be governed as seems best." I could go on for hours showing you the works of these great Christian minds who contributed to the birth of the American Constitution. But the real point I want to make is this. There's no question that the Bible forms a key influence in the birth of this republic, but not the way that some modern Christians seem to think. To listen to some of the ideas coming out of American Christianity since the mid-'80s, you'd think that the founders of this republic intended to build some kind of theocracy, that they intended to reinstate the atrocities committed by the church-state monstrosity that came out of the old world after the rise of Constantine. But the reality is precisely the opposite. And yeah, a lot of the early colonists failed to live by the principles they professed. So we actually had Puritans ironically hanging Quakers and persecuting other people who didn't agree with their religious convictions. It took a while to get to the point of actual liberty. And back in the 17th century, we had all these little theocracies up and down the east coast of the Americas, established by people who should have known better. But as imperfect as it was, and downright embarrassing as some of the chapters are, we did somehow land on something very important: the notions of autonomy and self-government. In principle, every individual would decide for him or herself how he or she wanted to relate to God or even the idea of God. If you wanted to reject the notion of a deity altogether, which some of the founders did, you were free to do that too. The government was not supposed to become a religious authority. Now, in the brief moment that we've had together, I've made a bit of a caricature out of the story, which is why I plugged the book at the top of the show. There are a lot of complexities, a lot of subtleties that emerged as these principles were put into practice. And as you know, there is very little in human history that is cut and dried or black and white. But the essence of what I'm driving at is this: the idea that people should be autonomous with their religious thought is an idea that was born not from the Greek classics, but from Bible study. So when I see people protesting in the streets, kicking a Bible around and then tossing it into a public toilet, I experience some deeply conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I find myself happily reminded that we have the freedom to do those kinds of things. I mean, consider what might have happened to those people back in 14th century Spain. They would have died a slow, painful death for doing that. So, on the one hand, it does remind me that we have unprecedented freedom. But on the other hand, it saddens me because the Bible seems to be getting the blame for intolerance, when it's the Bible that actually gave those people the right to publicly mistreat it. All right, I got to take one more quick break, and I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
There's a statement near the end of Luke's Gospel that sheds a lot of light on what Jesus intended when it came to the way He wanted the church to conduct itself. The disciples, who were obviously fallible, were arguing about which one of them was going to be the greatest. Here's the story from Luke 22. It says, "Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. And He said to them, 'The kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he who governs as he who serves.'" It turns out Jesus was egalitarian, and He warned us that the Christian church should never have a king. Unfortunately, in the 4th century, we ignored that advice and essentially invited the Roman emperor to take the reins of the church. And what followed was many long centuries of brutal religious atrocity. It's the same thing that happened when Israel demanded a king. It led to more and more corruption, worse and worse kings, to the point where the Israelites committed unthinkable atrocities. So God shut down the whole operation and let the Babylonians burn down the temple. And all of that happened in spite of the fact that God created the human race with a huge degree of freedom. Adam and Eve were warned about the consequences of disobedience, but they weren't physically prevented from doing wrong. That's the nature of this book. You are free to pursue God or reject Him, and He leaves that up to you. Now, He does offer warnings about what the human race would look like when it operates from a selfish perspective, because He's a God of love and He wants to warn us. He warns us that separating ourselves from the only source of life in the universe will have dire results. But then He leaves the decision up to you. Not the king, not the government, not your pastor, you. And that's one of the primary reasons I find the Bible so compelling in the first place, because it argues for human dignity and preserves the right to conscience. So maybe, instead of kicking the book down the street in an angry form of protest, maybe pick it up and read it and discover why you're free to desecrate this book in the first place. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been another episode of Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.